Without further delay, I'd love to introduce our keynote speaker for today, who is Gareth Hughes from University of Derby. We are delighted to have you with us today, Gareth. Gareth is a psychotherapist, researcher and lecturer. He is also a principal fellow of the HEA. In his session this afternoon, he is going to explore the relationships between student well-being and student learning and how teaching and curriculum development can support both. The full details around Gareth's bio and his talk can be found on the website, but I'm trying to keep it nice and brief here because Gareth's going to talk for about 45 minutes and then we will have time for questions, which will take us right up to or close to 3 o'clock, at which point we will pause for a very short comfort break before we move into the second part of the afternoon. So without further ado, I am going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to you, Gareth, if you would like to share your slides.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me along this afternoon. And hopefully this will be a useful session, and I absolutely look forward to all of the questions and discussion as we go along. So I think this is at the moment obviously a very live topic in terms of thinking about student well-being and student learning and what the relationship is between those two things. And obviously coming out of the back end of the pandemic, still there are concerns still about student mental health particularly. There does seem to have been an overall impact on the well-being of students generally. We're seeing in ONS data that student well-being is now lower than the general population and actually lower than matched peers who aren't at university. So that's historically quite an odd thing that you would suddenly find that young people particularly who are at university have a lower level of overall well-being compared to young people who aren't at university. So there's clearly something going on, and it's something that's going to need our time and our attention. But before we get to that, I just wanted to first of all just acknowledge that in terms of, I'm assuming most of the people on this call today are university staff, that we shouldn't ignore your well-being in all of this as well. I think I've said this before when I've done presentations to staff at Queen's, but it never is something to not mention, because it matters for a number of reasons. It does matter because actually staff well-being has an impact on student well-being. There is a relationship between the two things, and we're starting to see that more and more clearly as we go along. But it matters just because it matters. And, for all of you, we are still coming out of the pandemic, and that affects us as well as members of staff. And thinking about, as we go through all of these kind of conversations, what it is that we can do to look after our own well-being, both in terms of the environment that we create, the cultures that we create in our workplace, the expectations, but also how we look after each other and how we look after ourselves. And I think it's really important through all of this just to kind of say, it's okay to check in with yourself, acknowledge how you're doing through all of this, and to acknowledge what it is that you might need to look after your own well-being as well. And that just because we're talking about student well-being, it's not to ignore that or want any of that to go away. So let's just begin by talking about all of this then, about why we're talking about learning and well-being particularly, and why I particularly want to focus on the role of the curriculum today. Now, there's been an awful lot of work looking at what it is that actually impacts on individuals' mental health in society and culture generally, but also what impacts on student mental health more broadly. And we can see from quite a lot of the research in this area that actually our day-to-day interactions, the environment we're in, the culture we're in, the activities we take part in, the way we think about ourselves, all of these things actually go towards creating our mental health. It's everything that we interact with, everything we engage with, everything we connect with actually helps to produce our mental health overall. And so that means that for universities, we need to take what we think of as a whole university approach. We've got to be thinking about every element of what happens within a university, everything that a student may interact with, engage with, everything that we might ask them to do, because that's going to be impacting on their mental health either positively or negatively. And in some ways, you can argue that every university already has a whole university approach to mental health and well-being. It's just that some of the things that we're doing will be positive and well thought through and will be having a really good effect on well-being. And some of those things we might not have thought about as clearly in relation to well-being, and therefore they have the potential for negative effects overall. But if we're going to think about a whole university approach, the curriculum and academic staff in particular then become really important for this, because for some of our students, those are going to be the only contact points with the university. They're not necessarily going to join the student union. They're not necessarily going to live in halls of residence. They may simply be coming in and out to their lectures or to their seminars. So therefore, the role of the curriculum in supporting wellbeing becomes a really crucial part of this overall question about how we can better support the well-being and mental health of our students. Now, I think there are some valid concerns about this, and people like Catherine Eccleston have raised this. A kind of concern that when we talk about mental health and well-being and student well-being generally in relation to the curriculum, that what we're actually suggesting is that what we need to do is make it less hard, that we need to make it less challenging, because making it challenging causes students to feel stressed, and what we need to do is avoid stressing them out. So should we just lower overall our expectations of what it is that students can do? But actually, I think the research and the evidence and a lot of the work that we've done for the Education for Mental Health Toolkit, which I'll talk about in a bit, clearly kind of shows that that's actually not the case. Academic challenge isn't a problem. And actually, interestingly, students who we've interviewed for some research that we've done themselves identify that actually challenge in the right place and done in the right way is not only not harmful, it's actually really good for their well-being, because challenge that's meaningful, that's kind of exciting, that stretches them, where they can see their own development, that's actually really good for their well-being, because it increases their confidence. They get meaning from their learning, and they feel like they're engaged in activities which have purpose. So that actually can be really useful. So it's not avoidance of difficulty that we're looking at here, but it is about how the curriculum is constructed and the way in which we teach our students, we ask them to engage with their learning, and the way in which we construct our assessments and ask them to engage with that, and how well prepared we ensure that they are for all of that. And those are the things that then have the impact overall. So what we can see very much from the research is that there is a kind of transactional relationship between learning and well-being overall. So if you think about this, and by the way, for well-being today, I'm using that word as a kind of broad sense to take into account kind of physical, psychological, social health combined together to produce our overall sense of well-being. But if you think about that, if you think about, days when you were a student and you maybe had a cold and were feeling run down, your ability to sit in class and focus and concentrate and think creatively and problem solve were significantly reduced because of that. So we can see that the way our well-being is working impacts on our learning overall. But what we also can see from the research, and I'll talk about this a little bit more as we go along, is that the way students engage with their learning, how they are learning, then impacts on their well-being. And it's important to just note that many kind of models of well-being, if you think about the 5 ways to well-being, actually include learning as one of the key components to maintaining our well-being overall. So learning should be good for our students. It should really be something that helps them to preserve their well-being, to help them to flourish, to help them grow. And so if it's not, then that something's going on, something's going wrong. And I think it probably is going wrong at a much earlier stage in kind of schooling, but we'll come back and talk about that as we go through. Another little way of thinking about this, if we just break that down, and this is a little model that I've used and a number of my colleagues have used with students over the years, which is to look at the relationship of those different aspects of well-being with academic performance and learning. So this model kind of shows physical health, social health, and psychological health, which then gets filtered through academic skill, effort, ability, and the way students approach their learning to then deliver their overall learning and academic performance. And you can see that the arrows are going in different directions there, because we know, for instance, with physical health, yes, it can impact on how much you learn. If you try to sit an exam when you're feeling ill, obviously you're less likely to perform well. It also can impact on social health, because when we're physically ill, we're more likely to want to withdraw from other people, and it can lower our mood. So all of these things are interconnected, and actually we split them out to kind of help see the impact that they're having, but they are so interconnected, we need to think about them as facets of the same thing. So let's just break that down and look at those different elements in a little bit then, just to kind of understand that more. And the one that I usually start with, because I think it's one of the most interesting, is if you look at social well-being. So if you think about, for instance, the research on loneliness, and this is John Cacioppo's work particularly, and what Cacioppo did is he was a social neuroscientist, and he looked at the impact of loneliness. And what he found is that when people perceive themselves to be lonely, and that's the important bit, it's the perception of loneliness. They can be surrounded by people, but if they don't feel that connection, so that they feel lonely as a result, one of the first things that happen is their cognitive functioning drops. So their ability to think clearly, to problem solve, to be creative, all of that gets reduced. Their ability to concentrate gets reduced. Interestingly, there's also an impact on the immune system. If you take 2 groups of people, one who are feeling lonely and one who are not, and you give them both the cold virus, the group who are lonely are significantly more likely to go on then and develop the cold than the group who are not, whose immune system will fight it off at an earlier stage. So there's a broad impact just from that perception of loneliness. And for students, what's really interesting is he did also do some research which established that students who experience loneliness also see a drop in their academic performance. So there's a link between social well-being, ability to think, physical well-being, and straight into academic performance as well. We can also see that in terms of physical well-being overall. There's a huge mountain of work that's been done around sleep, and I could talk about sleep from now until the cows come home. We know that in sleep there are three things that we do in terms of our learning particularly. So we clear away clutter from the previous day so that we're freeing up memory space to learn the next day. We also seem to consolidate our memories while we're asleep, memories that are important that we're going to hold on to move into our long-term memory store. So when students are asleep, all the stuff that they've learned during the course of the day that they need to hold on to gets moved into long-term memory storage while they're sleeping. We also seem to do some problem solving while we're asleep. Some of that's cognitive, some of it seems to be to do with muscle memory. So musicians, for instance, struggling to play a piece of music, if they go to bed and have a good night's sleep and come back the next day, very often find they can play it much more fluently. So if our students aren't sleeping well, then that's going to have a real impact on their ability to learn, to remember the things they've already engaged with, to learn well the next day, to problem solve, and so on. Again, lots of research around the impact of exercise, food, things like sunlight. There's some really good research around the impact of being engaged with nature on our well-being. People like Miles Richardson have done an awful lot of work on that. Just being engaged in nature, being around it improves our well-being in a measurable way. But actually, if you engage with it mindfully for 10 minutes a day, it has an increased significant effect on your well-being overall. And of course, things like housing. There was a paper study just last week on the social economic determinants on depression, which looked at things like quality of housing. And we know that the quality of the accommodation that you live in has a direct impact on your mental health and well-being overall. And again, for our students, that then can have an effect if they're living in substandard housing, if they're cold, if it's dark, particularly, if it doesn't feel safe. That takes up a lot of energy, takes up cognitive functioning, reduces their physical health overall. And as a result of that, will then have an impact on their academic performance and their learning as well. And of course, we know that there's a big link between psychological well-being and learning. We know that students who experience mental illness far more likely to drop out of university, far more likely to underperform. We know some of the mechanisms for that. So we know that, for instance, if you think about anxiety, when someone experiences anxiety, one of the things that happens very quickly is that cascading chemical signals are released into the part of our brain that we use for our academic work. So the kind of the executive functions at the front of the brain. And what that does is it starts to shut those parts of the brain off. So the parts of the brain that we use to do all of our academic study, problem solving, creative thinking, all of that starts to get shut down as we begin to feel more and more anxious. And that might seem like a strange thing, but if you think about this as a kind of fear response, if you can imagine being confronted, for instance, by a poisonous snake in a country where there are such things, you don't really want that front part of your brain getting involved, because in brain processing terms, it's actually pretty slow. And it's going to start complicating things. As a result of which, by the time you figured out what it is you need to do, you may have been bitten by the snake. So what happens instead is that bit of the brain gets shut down so it can't interfere. And the more quicker parts of our brain, the more quicker networks in our brain, very often powered by emotion, just push us into action. So we jump back away from the snake so we don't get bitten, which is really great, helpful if you're just confronted by a poison snake. But if you're a student who's scared of exams, and you've just sat down in an exam room feeling terrified and really anxious, and suddenly can't access the part of your brain that you need in order to engage with the questions that have been set, then that's not particularly helpful at all. And that then can lead to students having a sense of imposter syndrome, believing that they can't do this, feeling that they need to drop out. That whole sense of self-efficacy, self-belief just kind of erodes as a result of all of that. And as a consequence of that, then students underperform or may drop out overall. So we can see real clear links then between well-being and student learning and student academic performance overall. But the reverse of that is also a really important thing to look at, which is that actually learning can be good for our well-being, as I mentioned earlier. When we stretch our students in ways which are really helpful and healthy, actually not only does it help to improve their learning, it can, if we do it in the right way, boost their well-being. And we know that actually when students, you can then create these virtuous circles where academic learning gives students a sense of belonging, it gives them a sense of meaning, it gives them a sense of pleasure, they might be passionate about the thing that they're learning. That then improves their well-being. Because their well-being is boosted, they have more access to those parts of the brain that help them to perform academically. They're able to learn much more as a result of all of that. That feels better, their confidence increases, and you then get this whole virtuous cycle going as well. So when we're talking about the role of the curriculum in terms of student well-being and student learning, it's really important that we don't just think about what do we need to do to avoid causing harm or to avoid causing stress. We actually also need to be thinking about, so what is it that we need to do to actually boost this? What is it that we need to do to actually really help our students' well-being through the way in which we teach and get them to engage with their learning and through assessment? So what we've been doing for the last, 18 months to 2 years, really, me and a number of colleagues, so those of us at the University of Derby, King's College London, Aston, Advanced HE and Student Minds, we've been working together to develop a kind of toolkit to help people think about how they might design curriculum that can support learning and well-being, so that we're not thinking of those two things in opposition. We're not thinking of prioritizing well-being over learning. We're thinking about how do we design a curriculum that actually supports both really well. And the good news is that actually there are ways of doing this. And what we've done is we've kind of highlighted some key principles within the toolkit. It's available on the Advanced HE website right now. If you look up education for mental health, there's quite a lot in there. So we've provided a number of, say, principled kind of areas. Within that, we've then broken that down into some kind of key themes that we think are important. And you'll see in there summaries of the research evidence and some research that we've done ourselves. It pulls together some key lessons, some top tips that hopefully people can take away, apply really quickly, links to other resources, and links to all of the kind of the research, because we've made sure that the whole thing is properly referenced, so you can go away and do further reading as well if you want. There's also a PDF providing resources that can be used in the training of academics. So when people are doing their postgraduate certificates in higher education, for instance, to help people think more broadly about the curriculum and its role. And there are also some case studies in there that you might want to look at if you're thinking about types of practical things you might be able to do to drop into the curriculum to support student well-being overall. But let me just focus in for now on the kind of those key principled areas that I talked about that we kind of hit on when we did our large synthesis of the research and what's seen to come out as being most important. So the first thing is to think about how is it that curriculum is designed and delivered within the institution before we actually ever get near students and teaching them and engaging them in the curriculum. How does this come about? Because actually the way in which curriculum is developed really has an impact on how well it can then support students overall. And we saw in the research that we did, we'd interviewed a lot of academics, a lot of quality staff, a lot of learning and teaching specialists within universities. Was a real spectrum of approaches across different universities, from still in some places where a program leader designs a curriculum or redesigns the curriculum by themselves. And the validation process is almost an administrative process where you just have to demonstrate you've carried out the right processes and filled out the right forms. To the other end of the spectrum, where curriculum is designed as a big team and as a really large team, not just the program team, but also including people from across the university, so that there's a range of expertise being brought into the room to help everyone think about the student groups who are coming through the door right now and how they can best be supported and taught through the curriculum. So that might include some students, but library staff, study skills staff, also staff from student services. So, staff who hopefully will know something about kind of mental health and well-being and learning, disability practitioners and so on. So that actually you've got a huge range of knowledge coming together to help then develop as a kind of co-created project, so that then what emerges is a curriculum which is founded more on key learning principles that can consider the broad student body and support well-being through the curriculum as well. This is Sally Kiff's design table, where she kind of suggests the people who should be brought in to curriculum design. I first saw this in 2011 down in Australia. I think they've been ahead of us on this one for a little while. The other things that occur in underpinning infrastructure are to think about how do we develop our academic staff to know and understand all of this stuff? What kind of training do we need to deliver? And also staff well-being. Highlighting again where I started this afternoon, to think about actually staff well-being is a really crucial part of this. And actually, if we want to deliver a curriculum that's going to support learning and well-being for students, we've got to have staff delivering it who have the resource, who have the energy, who have their own well-being, who have the cognitive functioning and capacity to do that. Because what we just talked about for students is absolutely the same for staff. If staff are overstretched, burnt out, over-anxious, their ability to kind of teach, assess, support students when they need it and do all of that is also going to be limited by all of that. So that's the first one, underpinning infrastructure. That then kind of sits under this. How all of this gets produced and supported and developed then sits underneath this. And then what we hope is that curriculum development design focuses in on the principles that follow. So the next one of these then is about social belonging. we can see very clearly from decades worth of research that students learn much better in classrooms where they feel psychologically safe. That is, in classrooms, whether online or in person, where they feel that they can make mistakes, where they can publicly get things wrong, where they can ask the stupid question in order to correct their own learning. And in those kinds of classrooms, students are much more likely to engage in discussion, which also we know supports learning overall, as a result of which they will learn more. Their learning will be more solid, more likely to be correct. And it is better for their well-being overall, because that sense of safety, that sense of belonging in the classroom kind of supports those social needs that our students have. Now, that's really important in a range of different ways. It's also the evidence suggests each other's learning are much more effective at supporting learning and well-being than classrooms which are seen as competitive, where people seem to be competing with each other, where actually you might want to do down your colleagues' learning because they're in competition with you in some way. So actually creating classrooms, creating learning environments where everyone feels that they belong, where everyone feels connected, and where it feels safe to make mistakes and get things wrong, then supports that learning, supports the growth of skill, and supports well-being. Now, this is particularly important for those of our students who are not from kind of majority populations. Now, Cassie Stahl's done a lot of work. She runs, along with Yannick, she runs Black Students Talk and Black People Talk, which is a group which helps support Black student mental health. And from some of her research, what she's identified is that when Black students in particular are in environments in the classroom which are predominantly white, and where they feel that what they need to do in order to fit in is adapt, where they've got to change who they are, where they've got to shift their language, where they've got to kind of not talk about certain things for fear of offending people, for instance. When that happens, they're using up a huge amount of cognitive functioning and cognitive energy on that task of fitting in, of shifting and shaping themselves and making themselves different so that they feel they can fit into the classroom. As a result of which, there's less left to focus on the learning, to focus on the concrete stuff. And as well, when people are in classrooms where they feel they're having to adapt to fit in, they are also much less likely to publicly want to join in discussion, because they fear being humiliated or being singled out in some way, or being isolated in some way. So thinking about how do we create a classroom space in which everyone's experience is valued and everyone's identity is valued as part of that learning experience overall, then becomes a really important part of this. So that inclusivity, not only of what's in the core content of what we teach, but actually the social space that we're in when we're learning. How do we make sure that that is inclusive for everyone? Because that can have a real impact, because we know, for instance, that with Black students, that does have an impact on mental health. It does have an impact on belonging overall. And therefore, we do see Black student mental health and well-being lower as a result of all of this. And then those students more likely to drop out. Same is true for LGBTQ plus students, for instance, students who are care leavers, and some universities also students from working class backgrounds. And that can play out in lots of different ways. You can also think about that the way that might play out for mature students, for instance, in classrooms where people are predominantly 18, 19. So thinking about that more broadly is then a really important part of all of this. The next thing is about where we focus our students within the curriculum. So the kind of essentialist positions in this is either learning or mastery focus on one side and performance focus on the other. Now, many of our students are coming out of a schooling system which is very performance focused. It's very focused on the end performance in those exams that people do right at the end of school. And what we know is that when students are focused there, they tend to learn less. What they do learn, they tend to remember for that final assessment and then forget. And it also then has a negative impact on well-being. That is it, because you've stripped out the value, you've stripped out the meaning that people can acquire from learning, and placed the focus on you've got to perform well, which also then raises the possibility of you may well fail. Whereas in learning-focused curriculum, in curriculum that's focused on actually helping students develop that mastery of their subject, develop that sense of mastery of their learning, help them to develop to be able to learn really well within the curriculum, actually students perform much better in the end. Their learning is much more solidly rooted. They're less likely to forget it. And it boosts their well-being. It has that positive effect on well-being that we talked about earlier, rather than the negative effect of that kind of performance focus. Now, there's some interesting work that's been done, particularly by colleagues in Finland, looking at deep and surface learning that kind of explains some of this. And we know that when students are focused on that deep learning, and again, this is an essentialist position just to help me describe this, there are obviously students who fall in the middle. But when students are focused on deep learning, That's when they're really focused on their subject. They're studying it because they care about it. They're passionate about it. They find it meaningful. Those students tend to achieve much more. They tend to get much better grades. Their well-being also tends to be better overall. And they're generally more satisfied with their university experience. Whereas those students who focus on surface learning, which is that kind of, what is it that I need to do to just get through? What is it that I need to do to just get the grade that I need on the next assessment? That much more extrinsic focus. They tend to do less well academically overall. Their well-being tends to be poorer. In particular, they tend to have much higher levels of anxiety. And they're generally less satisfied with the university experience overall. And if you think about what we've talked about so far, you can kind of see that because deep learning provides that meaning and that purpose and engages that all those positive emotions like passion and confidence, that helps to generate good well-being. Surface learning doesn't really have any of that, and instead it just puts all of its pressure on the possibility that you might fail, which then increases that level of anxiety, which then has a negative effect. And we do know that generally, people who have more intrinsic motivation, if you look at Deci and Ryan's work in self-determination theory, people who have more intrinsic motivation generally have better well-being than those people who have more extrinsic motivation. We all have a mix of both, but where the balance is does seem to be important. Now, this is really interesting when you then come to think about assessment and what types of assessment should we be using, because there's a lot of debate in the sector about should we just abandon exams? Should we just abandon essays? Are these old-fashioned things that we should be getting rid of because they're having a stressful effect on our students and causing harm? And actually, the students that we interviewed and the research that we've done suggests that that's not really the question. The question isn't what is the type of assessment that we're doing. The question is more, why are we assessing in that way? And how are we making sure our students are prepared for it? Because if the assessment is constructively aligned and it makes sense to students that they're being assessed in that way, and they have been taught how to do that particular type of assessment, they understand the question they've been asked, and they've had the opportunity to acquire the knowledge that they need in order to engage with that assessment, actually, whatever the type of assessment it is doesn't seem to matter. And we had students in our research identifying that exams were the least stressful thing they engaged with because they'd had practice exams. They knew what the questions were going to look like. They felt well prepared. They'd done lots of practice tests. So the test caused them no stress whatsoever. So that's a really interesting kind of challenge to some of the debates that we might have been having a few years ago in thinking about all of this. There are also, I think, an important thing some of our students mentioned, which was that we need to think about mixed methods of assessment, mixed rather than mixed, and a bit of a spelling mistake there, mixed methods of assessment. So that actually we're thinking about, different students perform well on different types of assessment, and actually giving students a range of different types of assessment would be better than, because different people can perform well on different types of assessment. But also we know from a lot of the research, engaging with different types of assessment also tends to improve learning rather than just engaging with one type of assessment overall. And I guess what this comes down to is that question of what is hard and why. And we kind of crystallize this with the kind of phrase, what we're looking for is sustainable challenge for our students. What we want is challenge that our students can engage with, can meet, it will stretch them, but it is something that they can meet. And in that, the challenges that we set them, whether in the classroom, online or in person, or the assessments that we set, the helpful challenge will be something that students will know how to do. They'll know how to approach it. They'll understand what's expected of them. They'll have the skills to kind of engage with it, or they're going to develop the skills by engaging with it. They'll recognize their own strengths. They'll have confidence to bring those strengths to bear. But the level that the task is set at should still be just stretching them, just out of their level of comfort. Whereas in stress-inducing difficulty, which is not sustainable challenge, the students then don't really know what's required. They might not understand how to even go about completing the piece of work. They might lack necessary skills to do that. And then their weaknesses are just highlighted overall as a result. But actually, if they had all of that, then the task itself might not actually be set at that challenging a level within the discipline. And I think that's really important because, again, in the research, we had a number of students talking about the fact that in their first year particularly, they'd been working on a piece of work, they'd been working on an assessment and got stuck. And actually just didn't know how to move forward because they'd never done this before. No one had explained how they needed to do it. They had no way of figuring out what came next. So went to academic members of staff who then said, well, this is the challenge. You need to figure that out. But actually what we're doing when that happens is we're normalizing our own knowledge that's been built up over years, over decades, missing the fact that actually for novices learn differently from experts, and they need to be guided through that process the first one or two times before they can then actually fill in the gaps for themselves. So thinking about where are we setting the challenge? Is it about getting them, pushing them through the academic content, or actually are we just making our processes opaque, or assuming that they have skills that they don't have? And this goes back to then thinking about how well scaffolded is the curriculum overall, because many of our students are coming into university without the skills that we would really like them to have in place. Now, if I think back to when I was in secondary school in Armagh, we were taken into the library. We were shown a block of books to do with our subject, and we were told, go and find some good quotations that you can use in your essays. Now, that's building really small building blocks of research skills that we could then build on when we went to university. It was a really helpful introduction to that whole idea. But if you're a secondary school teacher now, you'd be mad to take that approach, particularly if you're on performance-related pay, as many of them are. And your only measure is what do they get in their A-level exam. It would make much more sense to just get a handout worth of quotations, drill the entire class in them, test them to make sure they've got them, because then you know when they go into the exam, they've got appropriate quotations ready to use in their head, ready to go. Much better for passing the exam, but all those little skills that would have been built up in previous generations just dropping away and disappearing. And what that means is we've then got to think about, well, who are our students as they come through the door now? How do we make sure that the skill and knowledge that they need is explicitly contained in the curriculum? And in the curriculum is the really important part of this, because sometimes what we see is people trying to do this as extracurricular. Well, we'll put on some study skills modules that people can go to if they need it. But what we know is that those students who need it are also among the least likely to go and access it. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is because those students very often also have additional responsibilities. They may have caring responsibilities. They may have to engage with paid work. But it's also because of a very basic thing about things like anxiety. If you don't know how to do something, you're likely to feel more anxious about it. And when we feel anxious, we tend to avoid. That's just a basic human response. So students who are the most anxious and need that kind of support most are most likely to avoid it, because just the thought of going to the class to engage in the thing they don't know will feel scary, will feel overwhelming, will raise their anxiety. So by not going, they tamp all of that down temporarily. So we need to be putting this into the curriculum. We need to be explicitly thinking about how are we preparing our students from the moment they walk in, from where they are rather than where we wish they were, to make sure they're acquiring all of that skill, all of that knowledge, so that they are able to then engage with the assessments we want to set them at that really challenging level, all the way through. And that's all the way through the curriculum. So thinking about how do we scaffold from the moment they get in through the door, so that when they're in their final year, they are then genuinely independent learners who are able to do their final year independent study without having to come back seeking lots of reassurance and lots of help. And we've stretched them so that they're able to do that, but through a really well-designed, supportive, scaffolded curriculum. And as I said, that then helps to address that thing of avoidance. We've known since the 1970s that students who are anxious will either avoid, or the other thing that they will do is they will adopt revision and study practices that are actually less effective. So if you think about exam anxiety, students who have exam anxiety much more likely to adopt revision strategies that are ineffective. So things like just rereading their notes or just highlighting their notes. Less likely to adopt things like testing, retrieval practice, or spacing, or things like that are more likely to be effective and embed all that in their memory. And what happens is you then get this negative circle. The student feels anxious. They try to do some revision. They then notice that it's not sticking and not going in because it's not very effective, and because they're feeling quite anxious while they're doing it, so that part of their brain that we need for learning is also being switched down. That level of underperformance and not remembering then makes them more anxious. That then makes them want to avoid more, or makes it more difficult to revise. And you've got this whole anxious study loop going on. Now, if we can get in there with the curriculum, help students build up the sense of their own self-efficacy, their own belief in themselves, help them build up an understanding of what effective learning looks like. So teach them how to be students. So explicitly develop their ability to learn and to understand how learning takes place, using all of those kind of meta-learning, metacognitive stuff, teaching them about all of that within the discipline. Then they will see their own performance rise. That will then build confidence. And then we hopefully should start getting a virtuous circle going in the other direction. Which brings us to our next principle then, which is that the curriculum really needs to focus on the development of the learner as a learner, not just in terms of delivering the content of the curriculum. Now, I know some of the concerns that come out from this sometimes are that what we're doing is we're squeezing curriculum and disciplinary content more and more and more by suggesting lots of more and more bolt-on things. I would just actually, if we take this approach to the curriculum overall, it probably would make a little bit more space to explore content. But actually what we'll also do is we'll develop students who can go and find some of that content for themselves. If we help them to develop the ability to learn, to conduct that research, to judge what is good, to make evaluative decisions, to critically think, then we're more likely to have students who can do that independent learning at an earlier stage. And that's a really important. So part of this then becomes about how do we help them develop those skills? How do we develop that sense of ability, that self-efficacy? How do we help them to engage positively, emotionally with their learning so that they're motivated to go and do that? Because all of that then will produce good academic performance at the other end, as well as good well-being. And then the final part of all of this to think about as well is how do we get our students back on track when they fall off? Over the course of a full degree, it is inevitable that some of our students are just simply going to fall off track. Things will happen in their lives. They will get ill. Some of them will experience bereavements. There will be a pandemic, which we've just experienced. Some of our students will just make bad decisions. A lot of them are young. Some of them are immature. They will make bad decisions that just impact on their learning. So we need to make sure that within the curriculum, we have planned space and responses that allow us to get them back on track as quickly and as effectively as possible. Some of that is about making sure that the curriculum is able to kind of revisit and recap and help students reconnect with their learning where they need to go. And I think lots of the online resources that have been developed over the last 2 years really help with all of that. Some of it is also about that more structural stuff. So some of it is about how well do our academics and student services teams work together, because we know when there are gaps between student services and academics, students fall into that. So how well does that signposting process work? How quickly do we pick up students when they do fall off track? How quickly do we help them to pick back up? How quickly do we get them to the services and support that they actually need so that they can get back in place where they need to be? How well do we support our academic colleagues to actually be able to signpost? Because signposting is actually a much more complex process than it first seems. It's not just about knowing where support is and telling students about it. Actually persuading students that accessing it's going to help and that it will be useful is a skill in and of itself. So where are we helping our academic colleagues to develop that skill, to know where the support is, to have faith in it, and to signpost their students towards it effectively? And how does that kind of work back and forth? So all of that then I think needs to become part of that thinking about the wider curriculum, reaching out into the university beyond the discipline and beyond the program. And that's just what I've talked about all of that. And I do think, Bill, I mean, I've talked about this in a lot of places. I do think one of the crucial points when we're thinking about this whole subject area coming over the next few years is for us to be thinking about how do we make sure that academics and student services are working together, both at that end when things are going wrong, but also how can we get support service colleagues involved in that curriculum design table we talked about at the beginning, because I think that helps then to build partnership and that sense of collegiate working together. And then within all of that, we also need to be clear about thinking about what the role of academic staff actually is, because one of the interesting things from some of the research we've done is that even academic staff who are themselves qualified mental health practitioners, people who are teaching on mental health nursing courses or counselling courses or social work courses, actually, even for them, managing this within their role as an academic is still challenging and really difficult. So this isn't just about we need to upskill our academic staff to know more about mental health, because actually that's not the role. And equally, we don't want our academics to be the long-term support for our students, because for our students, that's not necessarily very good. Because if our students are in crisis and reveal stuff to you as an academic, and then they go away and recover and come back, we have had times where students have then felt really uncomfortable coming back into a lecture, into class, knowing that the lecturer now knows lots of stuff about them personally. So we need to keep that relationship in its place. And it's also unfair to our academic staff to ask them to step into this kind of quasi-guru or counsellor role. So actually what we need to do is think about, so what is that role? How is it going to work? Where do the boundaries of that role sit? How do we then communicate that boundaries to students? And how do we communicate to students what that relationship looks like? Because again, from our research, many students were saying, we don't know how this relationship works. We've never had a relationship like it before. It's kind of assumed that we know how it works, but no one's ever actually told us. We don't know when it's okay to ask for help and when it isn't, when to approach and when not, what kind of questions we can ask and what we can't, what the boundaries really are. So if we can establish what those boundaries are and then communicate them clearly to students, it will hopefully protect our students more, give them a more comfortable sense of what that relationship looks like, and also protect our staff by keeping them within the role that's appropriate to them. And it will hopefully then get our students to that more appropriate support much more quickly, where they can hopefully start to get better more quickly. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Please do visit the toolkit. I think there's lots of really useful stuff in there, lots of stuff that will really, hopefully, really be helpful to you. My key point, I guess, from all of this is just to say that it's really important that we think about being well and learning well not being in opposition to each other, and that well-being, thinking about well-being within the curriculum does not mean we have to lower academic integrity, because all of the things I've just talked about are really well underpinned in the field of education in terms of being, these are really good curriculum principles if you just want to enhance learning. Even if you didn't think about well-being, if you just wanted to really enhance the learning of your students, taking this approach would really help. It will also really help the well-being of your students overall. So if we can think about that, think about the way in which we develop inclusive scaffolded curriculum that gives people that safe space to learn, that allows people to develop as learners, allows them to build their own confidence, their own self-efficacy, to get that meaning from their learning overall so that they're focused on learning rather than on performance, then that will really help. And then if we can make sure that we have planned for those moments when things don't go right so that we're able to pick our students up and get them back on track as quickly as possible, then I think curriculum will be doing a really important and really powerful job within that whole university approach of being a positive influence on the mental health and well-being of our students overall. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we'll have some questions and some discussion and some debate. Please do feel free to disagree with me if you want to. I'm perfectly okay with all of that. But let's see what questions we have.
Gareth, thank you so much. That was really, really great. Some really fascinating points covered throughout your talk. I thought the point you raised at the very beginning, just regarding the relationship between staff well-being and student well-being, is so important. So thank you for that gentle reminder of the importance of self-care. Also, the toolkit sounds like a really great resource for staff for supporting well-being through the curriculum. So as you've said, we now have some time for questions. There were a few that came up in the chat, which we'll address first. But if anyone wants to ask a question in person, please feel free to put your hand up or put your camera on, and I will come to you shortly. So the first question we have in the chat is from Laura Kinkeat. Do you feel the underlying perception around the competitive culture of university education feeds into poorer student mental health and curriculum design?
Yes, short answer, yes. If you just look at the programs where we know student mental health tends to be at its lowest, so law being the first one, law student mental health tends to be lower than most other courses, and then you can follow that through things like veterinary, dentistry, medicine. They tend to be those that are more traditionally highly competitive in the way that they set out their classroom. You know, that classic thing of look to your left, look to your right, in 3 years' time, only one of you will be here. That's actually just a really harmful thing to do. And also, by the way, you're creating reality by doing that, because you then just make it more likely that students are going to drop out. So yes, that highly competitive thing. And it's also, it kind of feeds into a narrative that also sits outside universities, which young people get fed, which is that, you know, the world is an incredibly competitive one and you've got to fight tooth and nail, otherwise you're going to drown, which is also not really that true. But it's that narrative then creates this whole sense that disaster is around the corner, and that at any moment I might fail. And if you're living in that kind of environment, well, yeah, that is going to increase your anxiety overall. So yes, I do think that. And I just don't think, even if you just take the learning bit, there's no good literature, there's no good research that says that creating that kind of competitive environment does anything for learning or academic performance. And I think we've probably lost a lot of good students, particularly if you think about post-grad as well. We've lost a lot of students who would have been really good researchers, not because they lack the research ability or the problem-solving ability or the creativity. We've lost them because we had a toxic research culture which was competitive in a way which was unnecessary. So absolutely, yeah, I do think it's a problem, and we do need to think, look, let's use the evidence. The evidence says collaboration is better, so let's do that.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Laura Michael. What approaches would you recommend for encouraging students not to reduce their studies to surface learning?
It's really tricky because it's what they think education is. It's been drilled in schools, and you know, if I think about our lad, he's at university now, but when he was doing his GCSEs, first month of one of his subjects, he was being taught the subject as, this is how you answer these questions in the exam. No, here's why this is a great thing to know. Here's the love of the subject. Isn't this really interesting? Straight away, this is the exam question. This is how to think about it in the exam. So many students come out thinking that that's the purpose of education. The purpose of education is just to get the grades. and you want to get a bit of paper. So you've got to do it in a sustained way. It's got to be the culture of the program. The culture of the program has to almost address it explicitly on day one, I would say. And the things that I've taught and I'm teaching right now, I start the very first day, almost the first thing out of my mouth, we start establishing principles for how the classroom is going to work, which is about collaboration and a focus on learning, and that we're going to let the grades take care of themselves. And then it's just got to be constantly reiterated, within the culture, within the conversations you have with students, with the way you set the assessment as well, the kind of assessment briefs that you set, whether they push students towards formative learning or whether they are all about measurement. All of that, I think, it makes a difference, because unless we have that full cultural challenge, they're going to just default back to the norm. So it has to be the ongoing norm of the program. And I've seen some brilliant examples of it. It's possible. I have seen great examples of it in different universities and on different types of programs. But you do have to be committed right across your program team and right across the whole of the curriculum and if you do that, because what happens is we normalize to the environment we're in. So if that is the environment that our students are in, if that's the culture of the program, they will adapt to it. It will become normal. And we do see that when students then move to a learning mastery focus, they tend to stick to it, because once they've been doing it for long enough, it kind of holds because they like it better. So but it's got to be, there's no one quick trick there. You've just got to do it as a whole curriculum approach.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. Thank you for that. Denise, can I invite you to put your camera on and ask your question?
Thanks, Lisa. Gareth, thanks so much. That was a great presentation. Really identified with a lot of what you said through my experiences. But I suppose just one of the aspects that you mentioned there is this kind of vicious circle, let's say, when a student doesn't it comes across a particular circumstance that they're feeling challenged, and obviously as university staff we want to be there to support them, and that is our role. And but the thing is, relating to that point about, that connection between student services and academic staff and identifying whose role it is to support these staff, it is quite difficult when you've got huge numbers of staff. So that's where kind of the processes, the procedures, come into play, and then it gets a little bit more bureaucratic, which then kind of filters into students becoming more exasperated and creating worse wellbeing outcomes because they're expected to deal with this bureaucracy. And it is what it is, because at the same time the bureaucracy is there to ensure fairness, and if students are not perceived as being treated fair, then that also feeds into their poor well-being potentially. So kind of feel like you're in a rock and a hard place. And I was wondering what would you suggest, in terms of dealing with all those different issues?
I think I think co-creation is a really important part of the solution to all of this. And I think if you can get academic staff and student services staff having conversations with each other, even if it doesn't reach out to everyone, but you just start to get that thing that there isn't this, because very often what you find, I'm not sure how it works at Queen's, but very often what I find is student services live over there and there's a kind of wall behind them, and academics are over here, and student services don't talk about learning and academics should just be referring well-being. And actually that doesn't really work. What we need to do is kind of construct some kind of overlap, because that's where our students live. And so the more that we can actually start having those conversations and including students in it to say, look, there are these problems. So how do we do something better? How can we tackle this better? Because you might then out of that get some creativity. Then everybody feels they own the process rather than it being a bureaucracy that seems to have emerged that nobody kind of knows where it's come from. Students might feel more comfortable with it. Staff on both sides might feel more comfortable with it. And I have seen that work really well. I haven't seen anything that does better than just having lots and lots of conversations. And that's not when students are in crisis. I don't mean when students are in crisis. I mean institutionally, that there are structures in place that make those conversations happen.
Yes.
And I've seen a number of institutions really make a difference to the way things were working, because sometimes they'll just be like, well, this causes us real problems, and we don't even really need that. That's probably we just never thought about getting rid of it. But if those conversations aren't happening, those things never move. So I just think it's about the culture of and structure of making sure that academic staff on the ground and student services staff on the ground are talking to each other. and working together on that, because I think that then builds collaboration, and then it just everything works much more smoothly. But it's tricky because our universities are big.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're all trying to achieve the same thing in the end of the day, the same interest.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Gareth. I do think we've become we've gotten a little bit better throughout the pandemic of having those conversations and working more closely together. And maybe part of that is because we're now very accessible via Teams. It's very easy to join the dots, whereas before pandemic, everything was face to face. There was no such thing as virtual meetings, certainly not in Queen's, to my knowledge, anyway. So one step closer, maybe, Denise.
Yeah, thanks. I wasn't complaining, by the way. I just think it's an issue.
No, it's a challenge.
Just in case of any professional services staff or student service staff think I'm having, it's not that. It's just, it's how we work together and how best to do that. Yeah.
This is a structural problem right across the sector, Denise. Absolutely. I don't think any criticism is taken. It is a challenge for everyone, and you're absolutely right to highlight it. Yeah.
Thank you, Denise. Does anyone else have any questions at all for Gareth? We still have a few minutes left. Anybody want to put their camera on or hand up or even use the chat? Tracy, would you like to come in?
Hi, Gareth. Thanks very much. That was great. I think, coming back to the very foundation of learning, I suppose, we often, I think, across the institution, a big institution, as you say, we don't see the connections, that social, emotional learning. So, like, if you all think back to your school days of the teacher that really stood out for you for whatever reason, and why you picked certain subjects and why you went down a certain career path. And I think we kind of forget about that when we come to kind of further higher education. It's right, let's get down to business, let's get serious. And I think, when you bring it all, the layers back, I think sometimes we do actually forget about that connection with the social emotional learning. And I suppose my question is, how in a big institution, how do we, because, the social emotional learning is connected to everything. It's connected to the culture, it's connected to the physical environment, if it's accessible or not to you. It's connected to like who's in your learning groups, so whatever professional learning communities, technologies. It's really, for me, right across all aspects of higher ed. And I suppose it's kind of like, how do we think about that? How do we get that message across to everyone in terms of the curriculum, but again, outside of the curriculum as well, because I don't think the curriculum can stand alone to anything. I think it's interconnected with everything. So it's just How do we get that kind of message across to everyone, from leadership to students to everybody?
I think that's a really good question, and I think it really does put its finger on it. I think part of this is actually, having the conversation, I think, is the starting point of it, but it's about trying to get away from the metaphors for people and for learning that we've developed, and get back to the fact that what we're talking about is working with human beings. And human beings function and work in a certain way. And if we want to be really good at what we're doing, we therefore have to work with that. And I think one of the things that, particularly the early part of the pandemic, it almost seemed like particularly government ministers were talking about education like it was just content delivery.
Yeah.
Like you just had to put it into the memory store, like you were saving it on a hard drive. And that's what learning is. And it's just not how learning works. And whether we're talking about that learning through research or learning in the classroom, if you come back to the evidence base, and we're universities, we should take evidence seriously. If you come back to the evidence base as to how people learn, then this is what you would do, because this is what good learning looks like. And it would also be what good research looks like as well, actually, creating communities where for that good research comes out of that as well. A lot of evidence to support that. So I think if you come back to the core mission of a university and say, look, forget all the stuff on all the fancy metaphors and everything we developed. The core of our mission is learning and developing wisdom through teaching and through research. That happens if you think about how human beings do that. And that is then you have to think about those social, emotional aspects of all of this, because if you don't, then you're not going to be performing as well as you like in either of those two fields. And that's just fact. Like, there's no way around that, because the human brain can do what the human brain can do, and it can't do what it can't do. So I think just bringing it back down to those core basic things that cannot be denied or ignored and then to go from there, because I think a lot of the issues we talk about, whether it's about inclusivity or employability or retention or anything else, or academic performance, if you put a well-being lens over it, that particularly psychological well-being lens over it, it explains an awful lot of it. So if you looked at everything through that lens, I think everything gets simpler. Rather than feeling like you've got 15 agendas, you suddenly have one. that just applies differently for different students. So that would be my encouragement to start having conversations in that way, really.
Great. Thanks, Gareth.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Gareth, for that really helpful answer. Let me check the chat very quickly. I think there are a few comments, but I don't see any further questions. I don't see any hands up. I'm going to confer with my conference team. Should we take a break at this point?
Yeah, take a 3-minute break. Yeah.
Okay. So what we're going to do, Gareth, first before we do that, I have to say this has been really, really inspiring, and I can't thank you enough for coming to talk to us today. I remember seeing your talk last year, as I mentioned earlier. So it's really inspiring to have you back and to hear all that you had to share with us today.